Greetings to you all. Welcome back again. In the previous session, we have talked about what is development, the nature of development. We also talked about factors which influence development, and we have also talked about certain methods, qualitative and quantitative methods, and the methods of understanding development. Today, we are going to talk about the approaches to development, the theoretical perspectives to development. We will be talking at large about several theoretical perspectives which have been used in order to understand development. We will start with the psychodynamic perspective. We will talk about behavioral perspective. We will talk about cognitive perspective, humanistic perspective. We will also mention about contextual perspective and evolutionary perspective. So, we are going to talk about all these approaches. We will dwell a little more into these different approaches to understanding development of a human being. We will first understand what is psychodynamic perspective, then we will go into the theory of Freud. Well, psychodynamic perspective focuses on unconscious forces. It believes that most of our behavior is motivated by inner forces, motivations, conflicts of which the person has no control or has no awareness as well. If at all he has awareness, it is a very little awareness that he has about. The inner forces that we are talking about may stem from childhood, and this childhood is responsible for the whole behavior in future. That is, whatever happens during childhood, the influence passes on throughout the life. The influence is seen over the behavior throughout the life according to psychodynamic perspective. Now, we will go into Freud's psychoanalytic theory. I am sure everyone has heard this name. Even if you do not belong to psychology, Freud's name is known to many common people. He is talked about in several contexts which may be of interest to anyone. Now, let us talk about behavior in terms of Freudian interpretation. His theory suggests that unconscious forces, which I have talked about a little while earlier, act to determine personality as well as behavior. Unconscious is a part of personality about which a person is unaware. It contains the infantile wishes, desires, demands, and needs which are hidden because of their disturbing nature, because they are not pleasurable to an individual. From the conscious awareness of the individual, they are hidden. The unconscious is responsible for a good part of everyday behavior according to Freud. Personality, he says, has three aspects: id, ego and superego. Id is the raw, unorganized part of personality which is present at birth. It represents the primitive drives which are related to hunger, sex and aggression, and also irrational impulses which a person carries with him. Operates according to pleasure principle. It works on pleasure principle, and according to this pleasure principle, the goal is to maximize satisfaction and reduce any tension. On the other hand, a person's behavior cannot be totally determined by id. There is something else which is a regulatory system, and that is ego. Ego is the part of personality which according to Freud is rational and reasonable. Ego works on reality principle. It is a buffer between external world which has its own demands and then the primitive desires and demands of id. Ego operates on reality principle such that the instinctual energy is restrained, regulated, so that the safety of the person is maintained, and this also helps to integrate the person into the society at large. Now, there is another aspect of personality which Freud talks about, superego. It represents a person's conscience, it represents the morality arm, and it incorporates distinctions between what is right, what is wrong, and it dictates to the person what he has to do. It begins to develop around age of 5 or 6, because that is when the learning is strong, and it is learned from the individual's parents, from the society, from the teachers, from significant others in the society and in the community around him. Freud also talks about psychosexual development, which occurs as the children pass through their distinct stages wherein the pleasure or gratification of their desires and needs is focused on a particular biological function and a body part. Based upon this, he talks about a transition of a child from what is called oral stage to anal stage to phallic stage and then to the genital stage, with a latency period in between. And these stages he talks about based upon the gratification of pleasure focused upon the related body parts. According to Freud, if children are unable to gratify themselves sufficiently during a particular stage, be it oral, anal, phallic stages, or they receive too much of gratification, in either cases, according to Freud, there may be fixations which may occur. Fixation is a behavior which reflects an earlier stage of development rather than progressing further in the life because of these unresolved conflicts. Well, Freudian theory has been criticized for overemphasis upon the sexual drive. Then came Erikson's psychosocial theory. Freud's theory is criticized for ignoring the social aspect of it, and several controversies have been raised with relation to Freudian interpretation of personality. Then came Erikson's psychosocial theory. He is also a psychoanalyst, Erikson, and he provided an alternate psychodynamic view, and it emphasizes upon the social interactions with other people as well. Erikson's theory suggests that development proceeds through our lives, not limiting itself to the adolescence, to the genital stage which Freud talks about, but it extends itself all through our life, and altogether he talks about 8 stages. And these stages emerge in a fixed pattern and are similar for all people. And each stage in itself presents a crisis or a conflict that an individual has to resolve. However, not every crisis and not every conflict is totally or fully resolved. Even if it is not fully resolved, the individual must at least address the crisis of each stage sufficiently so that he meets the demands made during the next stage of development. Unlike Freud, Erikson regarded development as a relatively complete by adolescence, the genital stage. Erikson, on the other hand, suggested that growth and change continue throughout our lifespan. Another perspective then emerged, the behavioral perspective. In contrast to the psychodynamic perspective that we have been talking about so far, which looks inside the organism into its unconscious processes, behavioral perspective suggests that the key to understanding development is observable behavior as well as environmental stimuli. They do not insist upon unconscious forces which psychodynamic perspective talks about. On the other hand, their emphasis is upon what can be observed directly. And what determines this? In the environment. So they say if you know the stimuli, we can predict the behavior. In this respect, the behavioral perspective reflects the view. So for them, nurture is important to development than nature. We will talk a little more about these concepts in behaviorism. We will start with the classical conditioning. I am sure you all have heard about the Pavlovian dog and the experiment that Pavlov has conducted upon the dog. Well, let's talk a little more about that. This view emphasizes stimulus substitution. Classical condition paradigm emphasizes upon the substitution of the stimulus. Well, it is also called as Pavlovian conditioning or respondent conditioning. It occurs when an organism learns to respond in a particular way to a neutral stimulus. What do we mean by that? Let me explain. Let us say while providing food to a dog, a bell is sounded. The sight of the food naturally results in salivation of the dog. Now let us say a neutral stimulus in the form of bell is associated with the food repeatedly. After repeated pairing, an association forms for the dog between the bell and the food, and when the bell rings, the dog starts salivating. Stimulus substitution. So, this classic experiment of Pavlov has been used by behaviorists very well. John Watson was one of the first American psychologists to advocate a behavioral approach based on Pavlovian findings. He believed strongly that we could gain a full understanding of the development by carefully studying the stimuli that composed the environment. In fact, he even argued that by effectively controlling or conditioning the person's environment, it was possible to produce virtually any behavior. Yet another concept which we need to dwell into with reference to behaviorism is operant conditioning. So far we have discussed about classical conditioning. Now let us discuss about operant conditioning. It is a form of learning in which a voluntary response is strengthened or weakened. Voluntary response is strengthened or weakened by its association with positive or negative consequences. Please understand these terms. Please pay attention to these terms. A voluntary response is strengthened or weakened. How? By its association with positive or negative consequences. It differs from classical conditioning in that the response being conditioned is voluntary, it is purposeful, rather than an automatic or reflexive response like salivating of the dog. It was formulated and championed by a great name, B.F. Skinner. And individuals, he says, learn to operate upon their environments in order to bring about a desired consequence. It deals with operants, that is, intentional actions that have an effect on the surrounding environment. Whether or not the children and adults, whether they seek to repeat a behavior or not seek to repeat a behavior, it depends on whether it is followed by reinforcement. Earlier I talked about positive or negative consequences which will make them repeat the behavior. Now I am using this term reinforcement. What is reinforcement? It is a process by which the behavior is followed by a stimulus which increases the probability of occurrence of that behavior again and again. That means such that the behavior is repeated again and again. The term operant conditioning means roughly changing the behavior. By use of reinforcement, the behavior, the desired behavior can be repeated. Skinner studied operant conditioning by conducting experiments using animals which can be placed in a box called Skinner's box. Behavior which is reinforced is more likely to be repeated, while behavior which receives no reinforcement or on the other hand is punished is likely to be extinguished, in the language of operant conditioning. Like for example, in Skinner's box, when a rat is placed in a Skinner's box, when it presses a lever by chance, it gets food pellets. So in order to get the food pellets, it repeatedly presses the lever. On the other hand, when in the chamber itself, when the part of the chamber which gives a shock is touched upon by the rat, the punishment in terms of the shock will make it avoid that particular kind of behavior and not repeat that behavior. And what is that behavior? Moving towards that zone where shock is given. It avoids moving towards the chamber where shock is provided. On the other hand, it also learns repeatedly pressing the lever such that food pellets are released. Principles of operant conditioning are used in what is called behavior modification. It's a formal technique for promoting the frequency of desirable behaviors and decreasing the incidence of unwanted behavior or undesirable behavior. We will talk about yet another theory when it comes to behavioral perspective, the social cognitive learning theory. According to developmental psychologist Albert Bandura and his colleagues, a significant amount of learning is explained by social cognitive learning theory. And this theory is an approach. There is an emphasis on learning by observation of the behavior of another person who is called a model. It talks about learning through imitation. If operant conditioning makes learning a matter of trial and error, whereas in social cognitive theory, learning is a product of observation. Social cognitive learning theory holds that when we see a behavior of a model being rewarded in itself, then we are also likely to imitate that behavior and repeat that kind of behavior. Now from here we now move on to cognitive perspective. Cognitive perspective is known for examining the roots of understanding. It focuses on the processes that allow people to know, to understand and think about the world. It emphasizes on how people internally represent and think about the world. By using this particular perspective, that is the cognitive perspective, developmental researchers hope to understand how children as well as adults process the information and how their ways of thinking and understanding affect their behavior in turn. Under cognitive approaches, we will talk about Piaget's theory of cognitive development. Piaget once again is a well-known name which I am sure you might have heard of when it refers to child development. He proposed that all people pass through a fixed sequence of universal stages of cognitive development. And not only does the quantity of information increase in each stage that a person passes through, but also the quality of knowledge and understanding changes as well is also done. Piaget's idea is primarily known as developmental stage theory. His focus was on the change in cognition that occurs in children as they move from one stage to the other. And remember, they go through a progression of stages, one after the other. He discusses about three basic components in his cognitive theory. The first and foremost is schemas. Schemas are building blocks of knowledge, organized mental patterns which represent behavior and actions. Let us take the example of infants. For infants, schemas represent concrete behavior. Like for example, a schema of sucking in order to be fed, for reaching out for the objects, and for each separate behavior, there is a schema. In older children, the schemas become more sophisticated and abstract. Like for example, the skills involved in riding a bicycle, or playing an interactive video game, this involves much more sophistication and complexity in the schemas. Intellectual growth was viewed as a process of adaptation to the world. This adaptation or adjustment to the world has certain processes which facilitate the transition from one stage to the another, and they are equilibrium, assimilation, accommodation. These are the adaptation processes which facilitate the transition from one stage to the other. What is assimilation? It refers to using an existing schema to deal with a new object or a situation. On the other hand, accommodation happens when the existing schema, whatever is already present, or the knowledge which is already present, does not work, and it needs to be changed in order to deal with a new object or a situation. Now, equilibrium then refers to the force which moves development along and occurs when a child's schemas can deal with new information through assimilation. So, assimilation, accommodation, equilibrium. Now, let us look at the stages of development according to Piaget. It starts with sensory motor stage, which is from birth to 2 years. The main achievement over here is what is called object permanence. Now, what is object permanence? It is the knowledge that an object continues to exist even when it is not seen or heard. That is called object permanence. The next stage is pre-operational stage, which lasts from age of 2 years up till 7 years. It is a stage where children are able to think symbolically about things. Their thinking now is egocentric, as the child has difficulty in looking at things from the viewpoint of others. The viewpoint that he has is limited to himself or herself. The next stage is concrete operational stage, which is between 7 to 11 years. It marks the beginning of logical thought or what is called operational thought. The concept of conservation is seen progressively at the advanced age in this particular stage. What is conservation? It is the understanding that something stays the same in quantity even if the appearance of the container changes. Then comes the formal operational stage, 11 years on to adulthood. People during this stage develop the ability to think about abstract concepts, and logically they test the hypothesis during this particular stage. Having talked about the cognitive perspective, let us now talk about humanistic perspective. This perspective is acclaimed for concentrating on unique human qualities as its central focus. It contends that people have a natural capacity to make decisions about their lives and also to control their behavior. According to humanistic perspective, each individual has a capability or ability and motivation as well to reach more advanced levels of maturity, and people naturally seek to reach their fullest potential. Carl Rogers, one of the major proponents of humanistic perspective, suggests that people need what is called positive regard, and this results from an underlying wish to be loved and respected. Abraham Maslow, another name associated with humanistic perspective, suggests that self-actualization is a primary goal in life. It is an important goal in life. Self-actualization is a state of self-fulfillment in which people achieve their highest potential in their own and unique way. Now we come to another perspective, the contextual perspective. The contextual perspective considers the relation between individuals and the physical, cognitive, personality as well as social worlds. A person's unique development cannot be properly viewed without seeing how that person is enmeshed within a rich social and cultural context. Two major theories which fall under this category are Bronfen-Brenner's bioecological approach and Vygotsky's sociocultural theory. We will talk about the bioecological approach to development. This suggests that there are 5 levels of environment which simultaneously influence individuals. He suggests that we cannot fully understand development without considering how a person is influenced in each of these levels. This bioecological approach emphasizes the interconnectedness of the influence on the development of an individual as such. Because the various levels are related to one another, a change in one part of the system will affect another system. Let us talk about these 5 systems quickly. The first is the microsystem, which is the everyday immediate environment in the child's daily life. Mesosystem refers to interconnections between various aspects of this microsystem. Exosystem refers to broader influences of societal institutions. Macrosystem refers the large cultural influences upon the individual. And finally, the chronosystem is something which underlines each of these other systems that I have mentioned about. Now let us have a quick look at Vygotsky's sociocultural theory as well. He says a full understanding of development is impossible without taking into consideration and account the culture in which the people develop. His theory emphasizes how cognitive development proceeds as a result of social interactions between the members of the culture. Finally, let's take a look at evolutionary perspective. It seeks to identify behavior that is the result of our genetic inheritance from our ancestors. Evolutionary approach, as you might have understood by now, grew out of the groundbreaking theory and work of Charles Darwin. It also draws heavily on the field of ethology, which examines the ways in which our biological makeup influences our behavior. A primary proponent of ethology was Konrad Lorenz, who discovered that newborn geese are genetically pre-programmed to become attached to the first moving object they see after their birth. The evolutionary perspective encompasses one of the fastest growing areas in the field of lifespan development, namely behavioral genetics, which studies the effects of heredity on behavior. So, in today's session, we have talked about major theoretical perspectives with relation to development and what these perspectives have to say about development. We started with psychodynamic approach and we talked about theorists like basically Freud, and after him we also talked about Erikson. We said behavior throughout life is motivated by inner unconscious forces, and then we also talked about the conflicts, and then we also talked about the importance of childhood and how these conflicts and inner forces work right from the childhood on, and how childhood is responsible for the behavior later on. We also talked about unconscious, which determines certain patterns of behavior over which we have no control. Now, we also talked about behavioral perspective. We talked in this process about classical conditioning and the experiments of Pavlov, and in addition to that we also talked about Skinnerian principles, and after that we also talked about social cognitive theory of Albert Bandura. What do you think are the major differences between Freudian perspective and Eriksonian perspective in psychodynamic perspective to personality development? How was Skinner's approach different from Pavlovian approach to conditioning? What are these two major forces in behaviorism? What are the main features of contextual perspective? Can you describe them? The references used are Feldman's volume on Discovering the Lifespan, Herlock's Developmental Psychology, a Lifespan Approach, Papalia, Olds, Feldman, the volume on Human Development, and Schaffer, Kipp, Wood and Willoughby, volume on Developmental Psychology, Childhood and Adolescence.